Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 5 in our ongoing series, History of English Literature. If you guys remember last week, we talked about 16th century English literature. And today we want to talk about one of the most influential writers in the history of English language and literature, none other than William Shakespeare. Because of his monumental role in not only developing the English language, but also so many of the genres which have come to be associated with 16th century literature. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about William Shakespeare in this video. So, William Shakespeare lived from 1564 to 1616, and he's the most famous writer in the English language, honestly. He's also the world's greatest playwright, which means that he's someone who wrote plays for the theater. Shakespeare wrote many different types of plays, including tragedies, comedies, histories, and romances. In addition to his plays, he also wrote sonnets and long narrative poems. And because of his incredible talent, people have translated his work into every major language in the world. And even today, people still study his works, perform his plays, and create new versions of his stories. But let's talk about him just a bit more, including his early career. Now, when we talk about Shakespeare, um, something that is like of note to us is that he was born in April 1564 in a town called Stratford upon Avon in England. Now, his father, John Shakespeare, made gloves and sold wool, while his mother, Mary Arden, came from a farming family. Since education was important, Shakespeare probably went to the King's New School in Stratford, and at this school, he learned Latin and read classical literature, which would later influence his writing. Now, when Shakespeare was 18 years old, he married Anne Hathaway, who was 8 years older than him. And together they had 3 children. First, they had a daughter named Susanna, and then they had twins named Hamnet and Judith. Unfortunately, Hamnet died when he was only 11 years old, which was a great tragedy for the whole family. Interestingly, we don't know really much about Shakespeare's life between 1585 to 1592 because there are really no records of what he did during this time. Historians called this period his lost years, kind of like a black hole in his whole chronology of life. However, by 1592, Shakespeare was working in London as both a playwright and an actor, which shows that he had successfully established himself in the theater business and world. Once in London, Shakespeare joined a theater company called the Lord Chamberlain's Men. Not only was he one of the founding members, but he also became their main playwright. Later, when King James I became their patron, he was someone who supported artists with a lot of money. The company changed his name to King's Men. In 1599, Shakespeare's company built the famous Globe Theatre, which became one of the most important theaters in London. The Globe was an outdoor theater and on the south side of the Thames River, and many of Shakespeare's most famous plays were first performed there. Um, in the previous video, we talked about the structure of the theater and what it looked like, so I'm not going to really spend a lot of time talking about that. You can also just like Google it, but I'm sure just having a picture in front of you will help you visualize the structure of all of the theaters in London around the time when Shakespeare was alive. Shakespeare actually died in Stratford upon Avon on April 23rd, 1616, when he was only 52 years old. And although we don't have many of the original manuscripts of his plays today because those papers were lost, 2 of his fellow actors saved his work for future generations. And those people are, I would say, that really deserve a lot of honor because they're the ones who collected 36 of his plays and published them in 1623 in a book called The First Folio. And those 2 people were John Hemming and Henry Condell. So they do really deserve recognition because without them, we probably would have lost more of Shakespeare's work or maybe even like all of it. So let's let's now focus on some of Shakespeare's like statistics about Shakespeare. As you can see, he was a prolific writer, a professional success all in all. He wrote almost 2 plays per year. He published 36 plays in total, and all of them came out in the first folio in 1623. And he also wrote sonnets, long narrative poems, so he was a true master of the word. Now, let's talk about his major works. So, throughout his career, Shakespeare wrote approximately, as I said, 38 plays, 154 sonnets, and 2 long narrative poems. You guys know sonnets are 14-line poems. Narrative poems usually tell a story. You're all familiar with that. But we want to talk about what genres Shakespeare really excelled in. Now, he wrote a lot of tragedies. But what are these tragedies about? A Shakespearean tragedy usually tells the story of a noble person who falls from a high position. And this downfall usually happens because the person has a fatal flaw. So, which is like a weakness in someone's character that leads to their destruction. These characters usually face difficult outside pressures too, and these tragedies, the ones that Shakespeare has written, explore deep themes about human suffering, fate, and moral order. Among his tragedies, Hamlet and King Lear and Othello are probably the most famous works all around the world. But don't forget that Shakespeare also wrote comedies, which I would say are like diametrically opposed to his tragedies. In contrast to tragedies, Shakespearean comedies have complicated plots, mistaken identities, and romantic relationships. They also feature clever wordplay and humor throughout the whole text. Most importantly, comedies usually move from conflict or chaos to a happy ending, which usually is a marriage. And this represents the restoration of the social harmony as well. A good example of that would be A Midsummer Night's Dream. Shakespeare also wrote a lot of histories, a good example of which would be Henry V. Shakespeare's history plays tell the stories about English history, focusing specifically on conflicts involving kings and queens. These plays often explore important themes about leadership, who has the right to rule, and of course, national identity, which of course all are crucial concerns and were crucial concerns in Shakespeare's time. So, let's now move on to talk about his poetic and dramatic style. When we talk about Shakespeare's writing, we have to keep in mind that Shakespeare's writing style has several important features that make his work distinctive. His language is rich and varied, so he's not monotonous. His meter is also very flexible, and as you guys know, meter refers to the rhythm of poetry, and he shows a deep understanding of human psychology. A very important characteristic of Shakespearean text is that he uses blank verse and iambic pentameter. So first and foremost, Shakespeare mostly used blank verse in his plays. Now, blank verse, as you guys know, is unrhymed iambic pentameter, which is a rhythm pattern with 5 beats in each line. Each beat has an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable. Shakespeare made this form very flexible and expressive for dramatic purposes. In his early plays, his blank verse was more regular, with lines that ended with complete thoughts. However, as he developed his writing career, he made it more varied, which means that he began experimenting with enjambments, which is letting sentences run from one line to another, or run-on sentences. He also experimented with irregular pauses and changed sentence structure to show emotion and, of course, character more poignantly. All right, now let's talk about Shakespearean prose. In addition to verse, Shakespeare also used prose in his plays. Now, prose, as you guys know, is regular speech without meter or rhyme, and Shakespeare used it for different dramatic purposes and effects. For instance, he uses prose for common people or characters with low social status. He also used it in funny scenes when characters were mad or speaking informally, and to create contrast with more formal language of the verse, which was usually reserved for people with a high status. When we talk about imagery and figurative language, Shakespeare was a master of the form. So Shakespeare's works are full of vivid and complex imagery. Imagery means that, descriptive language occurs all over the place and it also appeals to the senses. And Shakespeare drew his images from nature, mythology, and everyday life. He was particularly skilled at using metaphors, similes, and personification, which helped him create powerful sensory experiences and express abstract ideas or emotions in concrete terms. He also used a lot of rhetorical devices, and we want to talk about them because they are an important part of Shakespeare's um, dramatic catalog. Shakespeare was excellent as using rhetoric, which is the art of persuasive speaking and writing. He employed many rhetorical devices throughout his work. For example, soliloquies and asides let characters speak their thoughts directly to the audiences. As you guys know, a soliloquy is a long speech that a character gives alone on the stage, while an aside is a short comment that other characters on the stage can't hear. Additionally, Shakespeare loved wordplay and frequently used puns or double entendres and other clever uses of language that added layers of meaning and humor to his text. Shakespeare's theater environment was crucial to his artistic development. During his time, I would say theater companies evolved from traveling groups to permanent playhouses like the Globe that we talked about. And because Shakespeare wrote for a specific kind of stage called a thrust stage, and for a particular group of actors, the capabilities and limitations of this stage directly shaped how he wrote his plays. What I'm saying is that Shakespeare had, I would say, an almost unlimited kind of potential for using language in a creative way or to create characters which would be very different from other characters. But because of the limitations imposed on him, not only by the theater where his plays were being enacted, but also like the limitations regarding people who were playing those roles, who were performing those roles, he had to tweak his plays a little. And so, let me give you an example. Like, because the stage was so close to the audience, for instance, and didn't Shakespeare didn't use a lot of like scenery, because bringing all of those like props onto the stage would have been problematic as people were sitting very close to the stage. And so Shakespeare usually had to rely on like complex plots or like deep characterization and rich poetic language instead of like populating the stage with a lot of props to make it more like realistic for the audiences. So those are some of the limitations that directly impacted how he wrote for the stage. Now, let's talk about some of the major themes, the dominant themes, as you can see, that we can find in Shakespeare's corpus, which means his body of works. Throughout his different works, Shakespeare explored universal themes that still connect to audiences today. And these themes appear repeatedly across his plays and poems, creating a unified body of work. The first thing that I want to talk about is love and romance. Shakespeare showed love in many different forms throughout his career. For instance, he portrayed the passionate, idealistic love in Romeo and Juliet, the witty fighting courtship of characters in Much Ado About Nothing, and the transformative and irrational love in A Midsummer Night's Dream, where mistaken identity also plays an important role. On the other hand, he also showed destructive, like jealous love in Othello, demonstrating that love can be both beautiful and dangerous. Another important theme that can be found in Shakespeare's works is power and ambition. Now, another major theme that Shakespeare was almost like obsessed about was the appeal and the corrupting influence of power. He frequently showed the terrible consequences of unchecked ambition and authority, which would, translate really badly for normal people if a king had unlimited power. And so these themes were really essential to him, but he also had to navigate the scene very carefully because even at some point, like Queen Elizabeth was the patron of these playwrights. And so they had to be really careful about what they could portray on the stage as as a monarch. Because, well, if the king or the queen did not really like what they saw, well, they would have withdrawn funding from the theater company, or people would have ended up in jail. Another important theme that can be found in Shakespeare's corpus is fate and free will. Now, many of Shakespeare's characters really struggle with questions about destiny versus individual choice. We can see this conflict in the play Romeo and Juliet, and of course, in the prophecies that drive the action in the play Macbeth. There are also other psychological themes that can be found in Shakespeare's plays that we're going to talk about. So, human nature um, has a very special place in Shakespeare's works. Now, Shakespeare had a deep understanding of human psychology, which, of course, is very clear in how he explored complex emotions and states of mind. He wrote masterfully about jealousy in the play Othello. He wrote about guilt in Macbeth. He wrote about madness in Hamlet and King Lear, all of them tragedies. He also wrote about revenge in Hamlet and Titus Andronicus. He also wrote about grief and joy. So his characters often have deep internal conflicts and psychological depths that no other writer has even come close to capturing. At least like on the magnitude that Shakespeare has done in almost everything that he has written. Another important thing that can be found in Shakespeare's works is the fact that appearance and reality clash. So the theme of deception, disguise, and the difficulty of telling the truth from outward appearances runs through many of his plays. We see this clearly in Hamlet's pretended madness and in the mistaken identities that drive the plots of the comedies like The Twelfth Night. And finally, one of the other themes that can be found throughout Shakespeare's works is order and disorder. Finally, Shakespeare frequently contrasts social and cosmic order with the forces of chaos. These chaotic forces might be internal, like passion or ambition, or it could be external, like war or political upheaval. So typically, comedies move from disorder to restored social harmony, while tragedies show the tragic consequences when order breaks down completely and disorder reigns. So these are a few of the themes that Shakespeare talks about. But now let's talk about his enduring legacy and why Shakespeare is believed to be the most important writer in the history of English language and literature. Shakespeare's influence on literature, language, and culture is enormous and continues to this day. His impact can be seen in several important areas. Number one, influence of Shakespeare on the English language. People credit Shakespeare with adding thousands of new words and phrases into the English language. Many of these expressions are still used today, including words like eyeball, or even lonely, or even break the ice, or heart of gold. These are all phrases that have come down to us from Shakespeare. His work also helped standardize English grammar and spelling because they were published and performed so widely across London and beyond. The second topic I want to talk about is transformation of theater. Now, second, Shakespeare expanded what drama could accomplish as an art form. He innovated in characterization by creating psychologically deep and complex individuals who really felt like real people. Like when you watched, imagine in the 16th century, and you were watching these characters on the stage who looked like you, who acted like you. This was what made his plays realistic for people back then. He also innovated in plot construction by weaving intricate narratives, but that kept the audiences engaged. And additionally, he innovated in his use of language by elevating blank verse to new artistic heights. Another important thing about Shakespeare's legacy is that he included universal themes and he created universal characters. Now, Shakespeare's deep exploration of timeless human experiences ensures his continued relevance across cultures and centuries. These experiences usually include love, loss, ambition, betrayal, joy, and suffering, which are emotions that all people, regardless of who they are or where they come from, experience. He also created memorable and psychologically realistic characters that continue to fascinate the audiences. So Shakespeare has been extremely important, not only for literature, but for the world of theater as well. And as you know, he's continuously performed and adapted all over the world through different media, be it television, theater, cinema, musicals, etc. We're going to be talking about those important writers in future videos as well. And we already did Shakespeare. Once we finish talking about Edmund Spenser, Sir Philip Sidney, and of course Christopher Marlowe, we'll be ready to move on to the next period in the history of English literature and talk about the next developments in this rich history of English language and literature. Thank you so much for staying with me and listening to my notes on Shakespeare. If you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up and please share it with your classmates or friends who are interested in these types of videos. And until next time, take care and I'll see you in the next video.